Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Doomed Productions podcast, a podcast put on by us, Doomed Productions. I am Jordan, and I'm joined by
Zach.
And Ethan.
Perfect. The three of us, the three amigos, are back.
The boys are back.
Oh, yeah. And this is a podcast, if you haven't heard us before, where we talk about filmmaking and movies and questions, that come up in that whole process of movies, making them and watching them. And for the last few weeks, we've been answering these questions submitted by our number one fan, Thomas S., who has been providing us with some really interesting topics of conversations, which I think have been pretty, engaging and interesting.
Thought-provoking.
Thought-provoking, yes. Yeah. Thomas recently suggested that he was afraid that people might be bored of his questions and his conversations. So tonight, we will not be reading from a second email that Thomas sent. We will not be answering more questions that he suggested from his email. We will not be doing any of that because, of course, Thomas suggested that we shouldn't do that, so we won't do this. Instead, these are viewer-suggested questions that we have received, not from Thomas.
Just in an email.
Just in an email that we have in our inbox. We're looking at them. And we have a whole lot of great questions here that I think will fuel some interesting conversations here. We might get through all of them. We might get through one of them. Who knows where the conversation will take us. But this first conversation submitted by an anonymous viewer. Now there's a main bolded heading for this question and then some bullet points beneath it. So the first title, I guess, of this question is, what are your opinions on adapting existing work to film? Example, book to film. This viewer then puts the bullet points. Should adaptations be completely faithful to the original material or try something new? And I think let's just use that as our jumping point for now. So
yeah.
Should adaptations be completely faithful or do something different when it comes to book to film?
Yeah. Book to film specifically, yeah.
When you think of a book to film adaptation, actually, really quick, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What's the first movie when you think, oh, that's a great adaptation of a book?
The first that it went to, opinions of good or bad regardless, was Harry Potter and then Lord of the Rings. Those are the top two that I think of.
Yeah.
I was going to say Lord of the Rings. That one's, I think, the best example that I have seen. Of course, there may be other adaptations out there that I am not familiar with.
Yeah.
That are better, which of course is
blasphemy.
Better is not scientifically measurable, so thereby it is an opinion. So
yeah. I think that shows how we grew up in the same era. I think Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings. I also think The Shining, because we'll probably get into a Shining conversation here.
Yeah.
But briefly, because that's a movie that's completely different from the book, but I think both are very, very good. Whereas Lord of the Rings, there's a lot of differences and changes. It is, I'd say it highlighted certain themes in Tolkien's work while ignoring the other ones, but it's not creating new themes that weren't already there. So it was a good adaptation in terms of we're adapting aspects of this and trying to be faithful to the spirit of Tolkien, which is hard to do. Anyways, back to the question: should adaptations be completely faithful to the original material or try something new? Thoughts and opinions. I guess there's no right or wrong answers on these ones. It's just our opinion. So
yeah,
my answer is yes.
Be faithful. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
explain.
Well, this person says, should adaptations be completely faithful or try something new? And I'm saying yes, as in either one or both or neither.
Okay.
Yeah. Or you can't really do neither. Either one or both.
It doesn't matter to you as much.
Well, I think it matters very much, but I think you can't just go with one or the other. Otherwise, it will end up bad. Because if you look at something completely new, my first thought when I think of that is the Percy Jackson movies, whereas it's a very large percentage of that is completely divergent from the first two the two movies that they made is completely divergent from the first two books. If you have seen those, I am sorry. You have wasted so many hours. Well, you haven't wasted. You can use it as a learning experience. I will say that of what not to do. But and then if you do something, if you stick completely to the original material, there's nothing for the book fans that's different from the book that they've read. So you're bringing nothing new to the table. So it's like one thing that this isn't a book to film adaptation that I'm thinking of, but I think of Rogue One when I think of adaptations, and it's particularly with the Darth Vader character. When I watched the behind the scenes and stuff on that, and there was discussions on, spoilers for Rogue One, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. It's awesome in my opinion. Other people may not like it. That's okay.
I love that movie.
Yeah, I love it so much.
Some people can be wrong.
Yeah. But at the end of the movie, Darth Vader shows up and completely obliterates a small group of rebels that are trying to, move the Death Star plans onto the Tantive 4 before they reach hyperspace, which is very shortly before the events of A New Hope. So that's a little background for you that are more maybe casual fans or haven't seen it. But basically, he starts, pardon my French, but whooping ass. And so there was discussions behind the scenes between Gareth Edwards, the director, writer, and some of the other people involved, the producers, etc., on like what all he should do in regards to like lore powers and stuff like that. So like I know Force Lightning was brought up, stuff like that, and they ultimately chose to do both stay faithful to what we have seen Darth Vader do in the original trilogy and Episode 3 and stuff like that, while also balancing, I guess, kind of bringing something new to the table, in that he's a little bit more spry, I guess, in his presentation, in regards to the power of his rage, I guess.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily bring any new quote unquote force powers into the mix. I mean, you see force choke, force push, stuff like that, but he's not like lightning blasting people or anything like that he's never really done in canon.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of discussion of like, okay, how will the fans receive this and stuff like that? And I think that's ultimately the question that is being asked is when adapting a book, comic book, or previous movie or whatever, other medium into film, is will the fans be happy? Will it satisfy them? Is it true to is it respecting the original material? Not necessarily is it true, but is it respectful of the original material that you are basing what you're doing off of? And I think Rogue One's portrayal of Darth Vader is, I guess, a good example of that discussion, and kind of finding that balance. And then you can, well, that's just my example, I guess. I've been talking a while. Somebody else talk.
Well, Ethan, when you think of, as a viewer, what do you look for in an adaptation? Yeah. Should it be more faithful or not, as a viewer?
Yeah. And I guess that comes from the school of, or I guess not school of thought, but just the experience of, have you been exposed to the work before or not? I read the first Harry Potter book when I was really young. I wasn't really interested in it, and I'd never read any of the other Harry Potter books. So my view of Harry Potter is different than the view of someone who's read the books and is a huge fan of those as a thing, and then goes to see a Harry Potter movie.
Yeah.
So when I watch Harry Potter, I'm pretty happy with those. Like I track the story, I get the characters, I understand it, I enjoy it. I think it's an interesting story. But then I've talked with a lot of Harry Potter fans who are pretty critical of the movies for cutting out big story arcs or things like that.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting balance of what are the story arcs that matter and what doesn't matter. Yeah. And I think, again, like Lord of the Rings balances that out in a way where, oh my gosh, Peter Jackson. I just had well, I was about to say Tolkien. I was like, well, he didn't direct it.
Movies,
But when Peter Jackson adapted Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, there was a lot of things that he did cut out. But the stuff that he made up for and being really truthful to the story and including a lot of, you could tell that there was a lot of respect and attention that was paid to it. And so I think those two things kind of balanced out into making a movie that everyone was happy with, where people who had no exposure to the books could have a good grasp of what those books feel like, but also not have to know what they are in order to enjoy the story. And then I'm trying to think of like I've been in an interesting position too, where this week I started watching the Wheel of Time series with my girlfriend because she's been a huge fan of those books, and has been reading them for years and has kind of talked to me about them, but I don't really know anything about that again. And going into that series has been interesting. So where I don't know. I don't know as much about it or understand it as much. And so it's like, what makes an interesting adaptation, or how do you bring in new fans? And I think that's an interesting thing. I guess I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit of what I was saying, but I don't think an adaptation is just for the fans of the series.
Yeah.
It's for new people. I think new people should be just as excited. And if it's too exclusive to people who have done the homework and read the source material, that's kind of a hard, you're not going to bring in anyone new or not going to innovate in any way. And I think that balance that you're talking about is really important. Of where do you stick true to the source material as faithfully as possible, but where do you divert so that the movie can exist as a movie? Because novels make terrible screenplays.
Yeah, a prime example,
horrible
which
pacing,
is a very controversial opinion, but I think is a very prime example of what you just said, that novels aren't always the best for word adaptation into film. The Hobbit trilogy, or what is now a trilogy, the Hobbit book, into the Hobbit trilogy. If you were to make a completely faithful to the original material, as is said in the question, version of that movie, it would not be particularly appealing to the four quadrants, you know. So
well, it's also the Hobbit. I think for our own sanity, we should avoid talking about the Hobbit not because I like the Hobbit movies a lot. However, when you talk about adaptation, the Hobbit is a really, really tricky example because of the circumstances for which it was written, and Tolkien tried to revise it, and the intent of because the Hobbit was the first one.
Yeah.
But then when you adapt it, it is now a prequel, not the first in a series. So there's a whole lot more questions, I think, to save us from our sanity.
This just becomes
that could be a whole case study, which is a fascinating conversation, but for the sake of keeping it on adaptation as a whole.
No, that's for some
professor
to do a whole semester on.
Adapting the Hobbit exactly how it is written. Just word for word, just this happens and this happens, like that. Yeah. With any book, that would be weird. I think the purpose of an adaptation, for me as a viewer, or I guess for me is if I was going to adapt a book or something, it would purely just to be getting people more aware of this thing. Like if there was a book that I loved, but no one really read, or maybe some people have read it, or maybe it's a popular book, but I want more people to discover it, I'd make a movie out of it. And whatever I did in the process of making the movie, it's to, there's a lot of questions you can bring up there about what's a right adaptation or what's a wrong adaptation. But I think at the end of the day, if you found a piece of art or book or an album or something that moved you, and the movie is just a giant arrow pointing to that original work at the end of the day. Because something like, if I made, let's say, there have been thousands of Dracula books, but I love Dracula. If there had been no Dracula books, I would make a Dracula movie. And no matter faithful or not, whatever people's opinions of it were, I would just be happy as the filmmaker adapting it, knowing, hey, more people are now aware of this awesome book that they get to go read. Anything awesome that comes out of the movie and everything, that's a bonus. But like at the end of the day, more people are aware of this thing. Like with Lord of the Rings, like there was a huge boom in interest in Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's writings and his legendarium after those movies. You cannot deny that.
Yeah.
And that's an awesome thing. And that's how the legacy of Tolkien like keeps moving forward, which you know, you can debate rightfully, like, is it right, is it wrong? But I think it's cool that more people are discovering Tolkien. Whether or not it's from the movies, I don't care. They're discovering Tolkien. The movies don't, like, erase anything he did.
No.
So I think that's kind of my opinion on, like, what's the purpose of an adaptation? Like, what is it?
Yeah, I think... Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, you go ahead.
To kind of reword and sum up what you've said is, I think we can all agree, at least the three of us here, that an adaptation should simultaneously bring new people into the, I guess, source material of like, hey, look at this. This is awesome. Like you said here, this is an arrow pointing at the original material, but also simultaneously rejuvenate the passion in previous fans. And finding that balance is, I think, incredibly critical.
Something like Dune is a great example of something that's done that. That's recent.
Yeah. And I think going back to that original question, should adaptations be faithful to the original or try something new? I'm of the camp that it depends on what the author of the original thing is. That's kind of where I feel like to an extent. I don't know. It's such a hard blanket statement to say.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to me personally, what interests me the most is the differences. Like The Shining. Like, I think The Shining movie is like a masterpiece. I think The Shining book is also a masterpiece. And I love that I have these two different versions of the same story. And I think that's really cool because, again, I think there's things in film you can't do. There's things in books that you can't do in film and all that kind of stuff. So I think that it should, I guess... what's the word? Where you use something to its benefit or whatever. It should take advantage of the medium for which it's being produced. I guess that's the way I would put it. Like, if you're making a movie out of whatever book or whatever, like a Pride and Prejudice, you should do something in the movie that you can't do in the book, if that makes sense. Like, because Pride and Prejudice, I've actually never read Pride and Prejudice. I think I read it in high school, actually, but I don't remember that well. But there's some things in that book that I would imagine you couldn't do literally on screen. So you have to take advantage of the medium you're telling. I think I think at the end of the day, faithful is not a question of are all the events, everything that happened in the book, did it happen in the movie? I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think you should ask, is it faithful to the spirit? Does it convey the same idea and the message and the meaning?
Yeah.
If you're going to be, quote unquote, faithfully adapting something. Because again, I think The Shining's an amazing movie. I think the book's an amazing book. Totally different. But, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't think there's, it's so complicated. Yeah. I don't think there is a should.
No.
Yeah.
I think it's
also tied into
circumstantial.
what's the story. You were saying something about the author before you kind of went off.
Yeah.
What was that you were going to say? I want to know more.
I don't know. Well, I think, okay, so...
Like you said, what's the author's intent, or were they still around?
Well, I think here, okay, I guess the best way to approach that rabbit trail is like, I can't speak, as an audience member, as someone who, like, watches those, I can't really speak to that, but as someone who, like, would direct and would adapt something.
Yeah.
If I was going to adapt something, I would look at what is the intentions of the author. If the author was still alive, I would try to meet with them and be like, hey, this thing means so much to me. I loved it. Blah, 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 blah. This is what I want to do with this. Is that okay with you?
Yeah.
Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Like
or maybe like, what's your feedback?
Yeah.
Less on, are you okay or
am
not?
I missing something? Or,
and like, am I hurting your feelings? Like, if I was going to make a Star Wars movie, I'd want to sit down with George Lucas.
Oh, definitely.
And I would want to be like, so you, obviously he doesn't need to know he doesn't need me to ramble about how much Star Wars means to him, but I would be like, this is my idea. Do you approve this or not, or whatever? Like, what are your thoughts on this? Should I change anything? And if my project is antithetical to what the author wanted, I probably wouldn't do it.
Yeah.
Because my entire and even if the author was dead, I would do a lot of research to try to honor that spirit of what the author wanted. But at the same time, once I'm able to feel like I've been able to do that, or I can do that, then it becomes, how do I do something new for the medium? And I can't speak as a viewer, because there's adaptions that I like that are faithful. There's adaptions that I like that are not faithful. And I love them all the same. At the end of the day, I think I'm able to separate the movie and the book really well.
Same.
Yeah.
So that kind of question doesn't bother me as much, even if I'm a fan of something originally.
Yeah. I had an interesting discussion with someone who is a literary student, like they're in college right now for creative writing. We had a really interesting discussion just about this exact topic, and he was definitely on the side of movies shouldn't adapt books because movies can't do what books do. But I was like, but that defeats the purpose of what movies can do. And that's the viewpoint I'm looking at it from. And he was kind of iffy on it, and one of the big things he talked about actually was runtime. And he was like, that movies are so much shorter than what a book story is, so therefore it can't tell the story in the full way the author intends. But I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. But at the same time, I think there's so much more than just runtime to a movie.
And I think there's an art to an adaptation, because I think when people say, oh, just make it a TV show, I feel like, isn't that a little lazy? Yeah. Like, trying to do the book as faithfully as you can, like having each plot point addressed. I think there's an art to like cramming it into a 2.5-hour movie.
Yeah.
But that's another topic entirely. I think addressing whatever that student was saying, I don't agree with that. Like, movies shouldn't adapt books just because a film can't do with a book. Of course, that's what makes each art form unique.
Yes.
And don't get us wrong, we completely, I'm kind of speaking for you when I say this, but we completely understand. I hope at least from what I've heard, from where they're coming from, and in many cases, I would say I definitely feel where this person is coming from, because it's like, especially with things like Harry Potter, having read both the books and the movies, and my stance on some of the later movies is kind of iffy. For the sake of time, I won't go into that, but there are certain things that are failed to be adapted from the books, and the question is it really Harry Potter anymore? For some people that are like really diehard fans, in the same way I can say about like people I've talked about with Lord of the Rings and those movies that share very different opinions from myself, are like, I did not like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, like the Lord of the Rings, because like they do these different changes and stuff, even if they're like super minor and stuff like that. It's like, yes, these certain things were in the appendices, but it's like, but this was where the art thing was, and Tolkien was so sticklery about what he had in his books, and like he wasn't even happy with his final product. Yeah. So we know that for sure. So it's like he wouldn't be happy with the movies. We know that.
Shifting away from the book adaptation, my sister's huge into theater, and we saw In the Heights. And she's of the opinion of like, and apparently a lot of Broadway people are of this opinion, who are big Broadway fans. They shouldn't adapt a Broadway play. They should film the play and release that instead.
So kind of like what they did with like Hamilton.
And I'm of the opinion that's boring. To me, because I think we've talked about this with May. I'm not into theater's not my thing. I can appreciate it when I'm there, but I think just filming the play feels a little bit like if you're going to do all that work, you should take advantage of the medium of film. Because if you're trying to go for that accurate play experience, it's going to feel like I'm watching a televised play, not actually being in the theater. And I think it really comes down to someone's preference, because I really enjoyed In the Heights, and I saw Hamilton. I was not like I wasn't blown away by it like a lot of people. I thought it was fine, but it didn't like sweep me off my feet. And if I had heard about In the Heights, I probably would have been like, I saw Hamilton, I'll pass or whatever. Having seen In the Heights, I'm like, oh my gosh, I really love that. I love the music. I want to listen to the album. If it was in town, I would go see it. So what that movie did for me was made me appreciate a medium that I'm not inherently interested in.
And with theater, it's so much harder to engage with an actor when they're not physically there.
Yeah.
With the power of theater is the fact that you are physically in the space with these performers and they're doing this play for real in front of you. Once you televise it, there is such a disconnect. I can't engage with them in the same way. So I think it's, for me, again, a lesser way to see a play. I would rather sit there and watch a play. Regardless of my interest in it, I'm way more interested in seeing an actor perform and do their art rather than have this televised version of it.
And
yeah,
before you speak, Zach, before I lose, because I'm going to lose the thought.
Go ahead.
But this is going back to that book, the literature student. I think it comes down to preference.
Absolutely.
It is 100%
for sure.
preference, because I prefer movies, that person prefers books.
Yeah.
That's the only reason we disagree,
Yeah.
is because that person holds books in such a high regard, films will never be able to live up to it, no matter what they adapt.
Yeah.
So by that point, it's just like, no, they just shouldn't adapt it whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so I think it really just comes down to personal preference. You'll notice that not a lot of movie people are upset that Broadway is adapting movies and that there's a lot of movie novelizations.
Yeah.
It's only theater sticklers. It's only book lovers.
Everyone else.
It's everyone
looking
else.
in.
When someone adapts a movie into another medium, movie people don't complain at all. It's always the other medium. It's always the other book lovers and
movie stands taking shots at everyone else.
Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you. I was going to lose that thought, but
no, that
go
was
ahead.
a very good point. What was I going to say?
No,
you're good. It was something. Oh yes, in regards to the theater stuff,
Because you're a theater actor.
I am originally a theater actor. Yeah, so it's
So you have an opinion.
it's very interesting because when it comes to adapting, the theater to film, you're moving from one visual medium to another, as opposed to moving from a book or I don't know what else you'd be moving
an
from.
album, a musical album, or
Yeah.
an opera, or something.
Or even like a biopic or whatever. If you're
The
pulling
story of
from,
someone's
like,
life.
Yeah.
documentary. Anything. Yeah.
It's very different because the way, like what you said, there's a disconnect when you film a theater production, because as opposed to adapting that story into a film, because if you're watching the production through the lens of a camera, and you weren't there to watch it in person, there is not that connection between, because there is a very unique and definitive connection between the audience and a performer.
Absolutely.
when you're in the theater, because you're feeding off of each other's energy.
Yeah.
The energy that the actor brings in turn affects the audience's reaction and emotion, and in turn that reaction and emotion fuels the actor to go further and stuff like that.
An audience that laughs versus an audience that doesn't laugh would be two very different ways you perform to them. Yeah.
Yeah, because it will. Yeah, you said it. It affects how you perform.
Yeah.
Because you're having to bring the energy more yourself than feeding off of theirs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And personally, for me, movies are like, so theater is for actors. Like, that is a highlight. Books are for words and sentences. Comic books is for that, graphic design, like the picture and the words, just in still, not moving, but still. Movies are about editing, manipulating time and space. I think whenever you adapt from one thing to another, you should take advantage of what the thing you're adapting it is.
Yeah.
Because you're never, ever going to be able to replicate.
Movies is not words on
Yes.
a
Yeah.
page.
Like,
And it's like
yeah.
a really good example that I just thought of now. I don't I'm sure there is a movie adaptation of this, but The Diary of Anne Frank is initially a play, a theater production. But there is some really cool stuff that you could pull from that they use in theater that is like, okay, here's something that we can do primarily in theater with this. And it's like, okay, how can you use that unique thing of like, hey, the entire thing takes place in this house.
Yeah.
You could do some really cool stuff with that in film, and it won't feel exactly the same as the theater experience, but you can still invoke similar feelings through a film in that way. Like, you can do really cool stuff with confined space in film and invoke that feeling.
Yeah. We're talking about Ethan's movie.
Not the other one.
Ethan wasn't going to bring up his own movie, so I will.
I didn't make the connection, I'll be honest.
That's just one example that just popped into my head. That was just like, ooh, here's a way that, like, you're taking the same thing that's like, okay, why was this written as a theater thing as opposed to adapted into a book? Because you're taking it from materials of her diary itself and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, you could have made a biography, you could have made whatever, but you chose to adapt it to theater. Why did they choose that? And then going in turn, okay, what was the reason for doing that, and how can I bring that energy to life in a way that is unique to film while still respecting that, which is like, okay, Diary of Anne Frank, you get the confined space and how that's just one example of many. You can play with that in a different way in film, but still playing off of that same feeling,
One of my favorite stories, thinking about the author's intent and everything, there are two movies at The Who, or there's two albums by The Who, Tommy and Quadrophenia. They're rock operas, so they told a story. They adapted Tommy into a crazy musical. Ken Russell directed it. Yeah. It's awesome. I love both of them. When they were making Quadrophenia, which is, another concept album, another story album, the director met with Pete Townsend, who wrote the album, and Pete Townsend came into the meeting with a bunch of recordings. He assumed they were going to be doing a musical of Quadrophenia, and they were like with strings and kind of orchestral arrangements of all of the rock songs from Quadrophenia and all that.
Oh wow!
And the director of the movie was kind of sweating bullets because he was like, he didn't know how to say it, but then he eventually brought up, I don't want to do that. I want to tell a real story with no singing. It's not a musical. I want to use other people's music from that time period of the 60s when the album was set. And I want to tell this story. And then Pete Townsend just put the tapes back in his pocket and said, that's cool. I did the album, you do the movie. You do you. And that was like the blessing he got, which I love that story. Wow. And I can't remember what you said that made me think of that, but like, it was really cool that the author recognized like, hey, what you're doing has no real bearing on what I'm doing. Yeah. And vice versa. We're both just artists. Like them being able to recognize each other as fellow artists, and that they're free to create whatever they wanted from each other's work, which I think that's really interesting.
The most freeing thing I think that author, or that in that circumstance, is the fact that the director is no longer weighed down by the expectations of the original creator.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is where you get to do your best work.
If someone was ever going to remake or adapt something of mine, I would say, I did the original, you do whatever you want. I don't want you to copy me whatsoever.
Yeah.
Like, I just go crazy. You do your version.
You want to be the Stephen King to The Shining.
Yeah, if Zach was like, I want to remake October, I'd be like, do Zach Hendrix's October. Do not do my October. Do whatever you want. Take the story wherever you want.
I would love for you to make House.
That'd be crazy. That would be crazy. That'd be a fun project for a year. Like, we all remake each other's movies.
Oh my gosh, that would be kind of awesome. Zach, you got to make a solo movie now. Oh man, you should make a solo movie when you're in your first term at school.
Yes, yes.
Your teachers ask you to turn in a short film, and you turn in a feature.
Oh my gosh. That'll be awesome.
You know
How does
I
the
would
man-
do that though?
How does that man walk with those balls he's carrying around with him?
I know. Yeah.
Like a kangaroo. It's the tail. Some would consider it imbalance. I say it is balance.
This
Perfectly
podcast
balanced.
is officially not for children.
We were so serious up until like 35 minutes in. Look at that.
A little gift for the viewers who are in this far.
I know. No, but I think it's really adaptation's tricky, and it's always existed throughout the history of film.
Yeah.
You know, because
How many Shakespeare plays have been adapted into film and are continuing to be
well,
adapted?
go to the early days of the silent serial dramas. What they would do. So, what's happened with every art form? Well, every art form was like, well, not, I don't want to say every art form. When it came to stories, they were serialized in like newspapers and like those little pamphlets.
Yeah.
And they serialized stories within them, so people would come. They'd have to get the next one. Film serials did the exact same thing. They adapted Fantomas or whatever popular serial, but as a movie form, and that way you go to the theater, you would go through, which was a very different experience back then. I'm suppressing all my film school history and everything. It was a very different experience, but they did that. They serialized the narrative so people would come and see the thing, but also if you adapted something, that was a guaranteed audience right away.
Yeah.
There are people who were going to see it. And yeah, that's just like, I think you can't ignore that aspect of like, there's always been adaptation. Like, there have been books that have been written on true events, like throughout literature, or like plays adapted from real events. And it's like, the question of adaptation really only comes up when it comes to movies, which is interesting. And I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's a newer medium. But I think
It's become so prominent now. Yeah. It's like most of the movies that have come out this year that are like names that people will have heard are not original works. Like the only one I can think of, I'm sure there was another one this year, I could have sworn, but like the only one I can think of is Free Guy. I mean, The Green Knight, that's based on the Legends of King Arthur. I mean, you get Spider-Man, Eternals,
anything
Shang-Chi.
Marvel, DC doesn't
That's
matter.
all from comics.
Adaptations.
Well, again,
Last Duel is based on a true story.
yeah. No one bats an eye when they do the billionth adaptation of Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah.
No one bats an eye when everything on Broadway is Mean Girls, Heathers, Beetlejuice, SpongeBob. I'm not joking. Those are all legitimate musical, and they were adapted from something. And I'm not saying
And
they're
I hear
bad.
the SpongeBob one is great, and I really want to see it.
I'm not saying they're bad, but I'm saying no one like from who's like into film has been like, why are they adapting it? It can never be a movie. It's never going to be the same thing, and blah 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 blah. No one's saying that. So it's interesting that conversation of adaptation only comes up with movies.
I do think it's interesting, and this is a lesser discussion probably. I think it is interesting when movies shortly after come out with novelizations.
I love those.
I think that's a really interesting thing. Like when the Star Wars
Especially-
novelizations happened that have a bunch of extra information. I thought it was really funny on Twitter. You'd see people arguing about Episode 9's plot.
Oh
Like,
my
well, it answers it in the
gosh.
book. I was like, well, no one read the book.
See, that book... Okay.
But
Well, I'm not going to get into that.
I'm digressing from the Star Wars, bringing us back down.
I
A lot of digressing in this conversation, but
the movie novelizations have been.
But I also think
love
of
those.
things like 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was written alongside the screenplay.
Or Scott Pilgrim
Yeah.
versus the World, same thing. They were publishing those issues as they were making the movie.
yeah.
Yeah.
So those are really interesting. Where it's almost a companion piece to the movie as
Yeah.
opposed to something that is battling against it.
That's something I've actually wanted to do for the longest time. Is I've actually been working on a fantasy series that I want to adapt to novels initially, but then I was like, also this would be a really cool movie, but I don't trust anybody else to adapt it. So I'm like, if I did this like at the same time, where it's like I release the book like a month before and then do the movie.
Well, the guy who directed Akira also wrote the mangas, and they
really?
take.
I didn't even know that.
They
That's
take
cool.
a lot of liberties, he took a lot of liberties between the two. But again, it's
Cuts
awesome
out
because
one of the books entirely, pretty much,
he cut off. Well,
because it's like 3 main books, and he cut off the last.
no,
one.
there's 6 books. They're right there on my shelf.
I
There's-
stand corrected.
There's 6 books. The movie adapts loosely the first 2 or 3.
Yeah.
But he takes a lot of liberties. They're both very, in terms of like the design and the aesthetic, they're similar. Obviously, there's a difference between animation and manga, but they're similar. But in terms of the story and the scope of everything, like the books are so crazy and like long, and
Akira is crazy.
I would love to see that as, you know, adapted as more faithfully. But I also think it's beautiful that the author was able to be like, how do I make a shorter film version of this? I think that's really cool.
And
too.
it's still such an iconic thing in and of itself. Like Akira is one of the top anime style movies out there.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the ones that gets brought up in every conversation.
I think something really beautiful that I heard said about Adaptation was from the Tolkien professor, Corey Olson, on his podcast. I think he was talking about the Hobbit movies. I can't remember the exact episode, but he said something like, when you see a change in a film that's different from however the book was, don't look at that as a reason to get angry or upset. Don't cling on to the like original text or whatever and be like, oh my gosh, it's not this. Why isn't it this? Take that opportunity to examine what you loved about the original work and what those differences meant, how those changes between mediums or the changes within the scene change the theme, the story, whatever, and enhance and help you articulate what you loved about the original thing the most, which I think is the most healthy way to go about it. Like, again, if you saw the Hobbit or like Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, Hunger Games, whatever, if you saw any of those, you know, take that, and if you were fans of the text and then you saw the movies, that's such a great opportunity to like use your critical thinking skills and think about the changes, why those changes were made, how those changes affected the story, and like what you really loved about the original thing. Or did it make you love the thing more? Or did you think that was communicated the idea more clearly than in the original thing?
Yeah.
I think it's a real... The conversation of adaptation can bring a lot of like great... I don't want to say scholarly or academic sounding conversation. I guess in more intellectual conversations than they usually become, because it's usually just like books are always better.
Yeah.
Movies, you know, it's usually that hyperbolic stuff. But I think it's an opportunity to really dig into like nuance and in some intellectual kind of conversations, but they don't really happen.
No, I think it's exciting to get to those stages in the movie where it does diverge. That's also an opportunity for you to get to enjoy the story in a new way, and not be just there checking boxes the whole time. I think that's why are you going to a movie to check boxes? Go to a movie to watch the movie. You paid money for it.
Phil, one of our friends and actors, he played the Scarecrow in our movie October. He told me the story. He went to the very last Twilight movie, midnight showing. Spoilers for the
I was wondering when Twilight was going to get brought up.
Twilight Breaking Dawn Part 2.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah.
In the movie, there is a big final confrontation where the good guys and the bad guys meet. There's a ginormous battle, and this battle never happened in the books whatsoever. In the books, they were going to meet, apparently, but then they never, like, things resolved peacefully. But when these fans, hardcore fans at the midnight showing, Phil says, when they saw this big battle happen, and the main character started dying on screen, it was pandemonium in the theater. People were screaming, crying. They were so confused. They didn't know what was going on.
Incredible.
And then it's revealed that it was a dream sequence, which is kind of brilliant. I love that. They took that chance to show, here's one way the story could go. And because you know where the story's going, your immediate reaction is, no, this is not how it's supposed to go. This is wrong. Why is this happening? How is this happening? You're feeling that same chaos that character felt who had that dream and imagination. And then you're like, oh my gosh, it didn't happen.
Yeah.
And then they can adapt it. Or then it goes, goes on how it did in the books, which I think is real. I think that's genius. I think that's awesome.
Had Phil read the books, or did he just watch the movies?
He hadn't seen any of the movies.
What a Phil move. Good on him. That's amazing.
He, again, he might correct me if I'm wrong, but from the way he tells it, he just showed up because he was with his partner, and he went to the theater just because they were interested in it, and
He just showed up for the last movie.
Man. He didn't know what was happening, but then he knew everyone was screaming.
What a great time to audience watch, because you're not attached to the screen, you can watch everyone else.
Yeah. It's really great.
That's cool.
You'd probably be very lost trying to follow that last movie.
That's how I felt in Wheel of Time, because I started on the 4th episode because my girlfriend and her sister were watching it, and that's just the episode that they were on.
Yeah.
But I do think it's interesting, again, where they've read those books. And that was like a 14-book long series.
Oh, yeah.
Like they've been reading for like a decade.
I forget.
The main author
he died.
The main
Yeah,
author
Robert
died.
Jordan died,
Yeah.
and Brandon
Brandon Sanderson
wrote-
completed.
he completed
Yeah,
them.
because Robert Jordan had written or had been working on the last book, which was supposed to be number 10, I think.
Yeah.
And he knew he didn't have very much time left on this earth, so he had been okay, what can I compile so that there is something, so that there can be some conclusion for the fans. And then when it was passed off to Brandon Sanderson, he decided to expand it into 10 through 14, I think it is, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I haven't read those books. I've seen the show thus far, and I've really been enjoying it. And I know a little bit about the lore and stuff. If you're curious about it, check out Daniel Green on YouTube. He's a brilliant dude who's a huge fan of that stuff, which is where I've gotten the majority of my information on that. But
I just get it spouted at me without me asking. But I think it's cool when they're watching the show and they'll pause it and talk about like changes they make. But they have a really, I think, a healthy way of talking about it, where something different will happen in the episode. They'll pause and be like, oh, this character is way different than how they're written in the book. They're way nicer. They're way meaner. Or that just straight up didn't happen. Or they're brushing over something that was harped on in the book. And they'll just talk about it, how like that's an interesting decision. But then they'll always end it with, I'm excited to see what they do with that.
yeah.
That reminds me, because I read all the Game of Thrones books, song-wise. I read all of those.
Yeah.
So it was really fun because there was a group of us who used to meet on Sundays to watch the show when it was like at the height of its popularity. And there's a huge event that I'm not going to spoil it in case you live under a rock, because it's a great moment in the books.
I haven't watched it yet.
There's
Is it the Red Wedding?
It's the Red Wedding. So if you know, you know. If you don't know,
2 or 3,
don't worry about it. It happens in book 3. It's a huge thing that any book reader is like, oh my gosh, that's crazy. And the show took off in such a huge way that normal people started watching it who hadn't read the books and had no idea that this had happened like 20 years ago or 10 years ago in the books or whatever. So what's hilarious, it was so funny watching that, because there was 3 of us who had read the books, and there's a couple people who hadn't read the books.
Oh, dang.
So when we watched that episode happen, we were watching the people, because we knew what was going to happen. We were watching, the people who hadn't read the books. And Phil was there, actually. Phil had not read the books. His reactions were fantastic to that episode. And that was a fun example of like the book readers knowing what's coming, the show delivering on that, and creating like an impact across the board for all the fans. Because even if you knew what was coming, it didn't ruin the moment. If you didn't know what was coming, oh boy, you provided so much entertainment for everyone else.
And after the season 1 finale, I will not spoil that. But after that, that's like the big moment that really defined where that series was in regards to like, oh shoot, you don't know what's gonna happen without spoiling anything, of course. But which is where such a large appeal came in for casual viewers or casual fans, I guess. Yeah. That hadn't read the books. Yeah. I still haven't read the books, but I know some of the differences and stuff like that.
Yeah. Pretty good.
But,
pretty good. It's gosh, that brings up so many. I think we can keep going on and on and on.
Oh yeah.
But let's end with this last question. I want you to tell me your favorite. What comes to mind when you think of like one of your favorite movies that was adapted from something else? I'm gonna go first so you guys can think. But I think Watchmen, the Zack Snyder movie, is one of my favorite adaptations, and I think it's really, I don't want to say underrated because it made a lot of money, a lot of people like it, but I think there's I guess, I don't know what you call an opinion where it's like someone said it once and then everybody started saying it and believes it to be true, but like that Zack Snyder doesn't get Watchmen. I think that's totally false. I think he understands it in a way more nuanced way than people give him credit for. And I think there's a lot of smart things that are going on in that movie that a lot of people just, because again, Zack Snyder's a whole nother topic when it comes to how film discourse goes about. But I think a lot of people think Zack Snyder's not smart, so therefore he can't have done this thing. It's a very surface level reading where it's just like, oh, well, it's Zack Snyder, so he's not going to make any smart choices. Everything's for this reason, but...
More like Hack Snyder.
Yeah, I know. So, like, everybody...
An opinion I do not believe.
Everybody... If you review Watchmen and you say that, like, Zack Snyder adapted... It's a faithful adaptation, but he missed the point of the book, that's a paradox. You can't be faithful to the original thing and not understand it.
Yeah.
It's either he went off a completely new direction and didn't understand it, or he followed it exactly and he understood it. That's a whole other thing. I don't think he followed it exactly, but I don't think he went way off the board. I think what he did was something different and was really interesting. And I want to highlight a video essay by Style is Substance. I think it's called, it's on Watchmen. It's like an hour-long video essay or something. It breaks down a lot of really interesting, engaging stuff about that specific movie. But I think, for me, that movie is a lot more interesting than a lot of people give it credit for in terms when it comes to adaptation and the choices that were made.
What was the documentary called? Sorry, I'm writing it down right now.
It's on YouTube.
Okay.
It's on a channel called Style is Substance. Style is Substance. Okay. Oh, no. Sorry, I'm...
Cool.
Style is Substance.
Because
Nobody Gets Zack Snyder. That's the title of the video.
Okay.
And it's a great comparison between the movie, the comic book, but also the TV show a little bit sprinkled in there.
Oh, yeah.
And I think it really breaks down what Snyder was doing. And it kind of ties it all into a weird way, like the zeitgeist of whenever Zack Snyder says something, it gets blown out of proportion and misquoted, misunderstood. And it kind of frames the whole thing with the context of the talking about Batman. And I think in his words he said something like, when someone says, my heroes didn't kill anybody, Batman killed a guy, you're living in a dream world. That quote. And putting context behind that, which is really, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that obviously because it's Snyder, it blows up and then people will misinterpret it or misrepresent it or whatever. But Watchmen to me is a really interesting case. I wish I could break down all the reasons, but it'd be too long. Yeah. And this guy, Styles of Substance, he did a lot better. So check out that. What are your guys' adaptations?
Yeah. I think mine, again, riffing off comic books, is Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy.
Yeah.
Did I steal it from you? I am glad
you stole one of the ones from me.
Glad I went first. Because I was afraid you were gonna steal it, so I said it.
Pulled a little sneaky on you.
Yeah.
But we can reminisce about it together right now. But that was one of the main comic books I grew up reading, because in the Oregonian newspaper every Sunday they would give a classic comic book print, so it was like a full-size comic book, and so I read those for years. I saved all of them. I loved Spider-Man growing up, and I read those along with watching the Raimi movies because those were coming out at the same time.
It was leading up to Spider-Man 3.
Yeah, and so just that, I can't put it into words really. But I really just enjoyed that Spider-Man experience, and I felt like those movies had a very relatable Peter Parker in the way that I felt like is very faithful to how the comics portray him, as
definitely.
he is very much this
Which version
dorky,
of the comics?
Okay. Those comics.
That's the question. Yeah.
Those comics
The
that I
OG
read
Amazing
specifically
Spider-Man, yeah.
of this dorky kid who's given this great power and has to wield it. And I think that the Raimi trilogy gave those so much depth and really took the Spider-Man stuff in a great direction. And I can't speak to all of Spider-Man, how his influences pulled from other stuff, because I'm sure he did. I'm looking at it only from those OG Stan Lee Spider-Mans, because again, that's the frame of reference I had from it. But I just really enjoyed what Sam Raimi did and how he adapted those characters.
Especially given that I have major respect for him with the third installment because he still there are of course conflicting opinions out there.
I like Spider-Man 3. I'll say
I
love
have
Spider-Man
conflicting emotions in regards to the film itself, but I still think that despite the studio interference and not necessarily getting to or being forced to do things that he didn't necessarily want to do, he was still able to.
He wrapped up his trilogy in a way that felt good. I think that ends in a really great way, and it ties up a lot of things really well.
And really still gets who Peter is, and kind of in the same way that BVS does with Batman, breaks down the character in a very interesting way, while still understanding the character and putting them in a really interesting situation that you may not necessarily have seen specifically in that way, I guess. But I would normally I go with Lord of the Rings, and that's just my classic answer. But I didn't necessarily want to give that. So
how original! Just kidding.
I was gonna say Spider-Man too, but
well,
I would also say Batman versus Superman, the Ultimate Edition, the theatrical situation is a little different, but
bunch of comic nerds in this room.
I know. Maybe we should give some novels.
Color from Outer Space with Nicolas Cage. Color Out of Space. As this movie I recommended to someone this week. That's another great adaptation of a Lovecraft story. That does a very different thing from the story, but very cool.
Yeah. I was not expecting that to be set in modern times, but it was, and it worked good. It was cool.
And once you throw Nicolas Cage in the mix, you know you got something great.
You're good. Yeah.
I need to read Annihilation, but I know it's a very good movie. I have the first book, but I haven't cracked it open yet.
Film school. I still need to read the books because I was very intrigued.
Yeah, I think if I think of a a book? I forgot what a book was.
What is it with words and pages?
I know, words and pages.
Oh, I know what mine is going to be. Harry Potter, The Prisoner of Azkaban. That one specifically
that is a phenomenal
so
movie.
good. I think I will die on the hill that is the best Harry Potter movie.
I can agree with that.
And best Harry Potter book as well. So
yeah.
And why is it slipping in my mind right now? Because he's such a good filmmaker. But the dude that did that one,
the director.
Yeah. Why am I forgetting?
Alfonso Cuarón.
Alfonso. That dude does such a good job and brought such new life and energy to that series and of course I love Chris Columbus as well and what he did with the first two. That was great, but it definitely gave a different vibe that was really cool too.
That third one it's a banger. It's a good movie. I think in my last little book adaptation, I'll throw in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Tim Burton, the Disney. Well, I do love the Tim Burton. I love that.
But you're saying
but I love the cartoon as well. I mean, both of those actually. I think those are
for very different reasons.
For very different reasons. I love those two movies, and I guess technically it's The Adventures of Mr. Toad and Ichabod Crane. I've never read Mr. Wind in the Willows. So I don't know how good that is. But I love that movie because that was an adaptation of two different books.
Yeah.
But yeah. Any final thoughts that we have on adaptation?
Books are boring. Watch movies instead.
Watch movies.
I will not say
a very educated answer. Just kidding. Read books. Books are awesome. Go stay in school.
Yeah, I guess I would just encourage people to, read the books, read the comics, listen to the albums, watch the movies, and discuss it engage with the material rather than dismiss it. I would say, if you notice changes, kind of like the Tolkien professor said, think of it as an opportunity to discover more about what you love about that original thing, and I think it's interesting. And if you're a filmmaker who wants to adapt something, just do it. No one's stopping you. There's lots of fan films out there.
Yeah. You might just do something incredible with it.
Yeah, exactly. So thanks for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Doom Production Podcast. Hit that subscribe and like button if you're listening to us on YouTube. And follow us on Spotify if you're listening to us on Spotify, or hop on over to our YouTube and subscribe to us. We've got some cool stuff coming, so you want to be alert for when that stuff happens.
Oh man, that's the alert right now that you should be subscribing.
Diabetes thing is going off. Sorry.
So we will. Thanks for listening. and we'll see you on the next one.